Thank you for being here in this new section of Christian Lectures. This is part of our ongoing series exploring the foundations of Christianity in a clear and structured way. In this video, we are stepping back to examine two foundational movements in the Old Testament. First, the progressive decline of humanity in Genesis 1 to 11. Second, the prophetic ministry of Isaiah during a time of national crisis. These are not isolated stories. Together they show us how Scripture understands human failure, divine judgment, and enduring hope. Let us begin at the beginning. Genesis opens with order and harmony. Creation is described as good, and finally, as very good. Humanity is made in the image of God and entrusted with stewardship over creation. There is relational harmony between God and humanity, between man and woman, and between humanity and the earth. There is no shame, no fear, and no fragmentation. This is the theological starting point. The decline begins in Genesis 3. The question raised by the serpent introduces doubt about God's goodness. The temptation is not merely disobedience, it is autonomy. Humanity chooses to define good and evil independently of God. The result is immediate alienation. Shame replaces innocence. Hiding replaces openness. Blame replaces unity. Exile from Eden becomes the symbol of broken communion. The next stage deepens the fracture. In Genesis 4, Cain murders Abel. Violence enters human history. The denial of responsibility, expressed in the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" reveals a new dimension of moral decline. Sin is no longer confined to personal disobedience. It spreads into family relationships and social order. By Genesis 6, corruption has become systemic. The text describes humanity as continually inclined toward evil. Violence fills the earth. The flood narrative presents judgment, but it also reveals divine grief. God is portrayed not as indifferent, but as wounded by human corruption. Yet even here, preservation appears. Noah is spared. A covenant is established. The rainbow becomes a sign of restraint and promise. The final episode of the primeval history occurs at Babel. Humanity unites, but not in worship. The people seek to make a name for themselves. The project represents collective pride and centralized self-sufficiency. God responds by confusing language and scattering the nations. Unity becomes fragmentation. Communication becomes division. The narrative arc from Genesis 1 to 11 is clear. Individual disobedience becomes family violence. Family violence becomes societal corruption. Societal corruption becomes global arrogance. The scale widens at each stage, yet decline is never presented as the final word. After Babel, Genesis 12 introduces Abraham. Where humanity sought to make its own name great, God promises to make Abraham's name great. The story of decline becomes the prelude to covenant and redemption. Scripture does not deny human failure. It situates it within divine purpose. Several centuries later, the same pattern appears on a national scale in the ministry of Isaiah. Isaiah lived in the 8th century before Christ during a period marked by internal instability and external threat. The Assyrian Empire was expanding aggressively. Judah faced military pressure and political uncertainty. At the same time, moral corruption weakened the nation from within. Isaiah begins his ministry with a vision of divine holiness. In the temple, he sees the Lord high and lifted up. The declaration, "Holy, holy, holy," establishes the foundation of his prophetic authority. Before addressing the nation, Isaiah confronts his own unworthiness. Cleansing precedes commission. Prophetic speech flows from encounter with God. Internally, Judah suffered from injustice and hollow religious practice. Isaiah condemns sacrifices offered without righteousness. Worship continued, but justice was neglected. The vulnerable were ignored. The prophet insists that covenant faithfulness requires ethical obedience. Religious activity cannot substitute for moral integrity. Externally, The crisis intensified during the Syro-Ephraimite conflict and later the Assyrian invasion. King Ahaz chose political alliance over trusting God. Isaiah confronted this decision directly. He warned that faith, not diplomacy alone, secures stability. The sign of Emmanuel, God with us, affirmed divine presence in the midst of uncertainty. Later, when Jerusalem was threatened by Assyria, Isaiah again emphasized trust in Yahweh rather than dependence on imperial power. Isaiah interpreted political events through theological conviction. Nations rise and fall within divine sovereignty. External invasion was not meaningless chaos, but part of a larger providential framework. Yet alongside warning, he proclaimed hope. He spoke of a future Davidic ruler characterized by wisdom, justice, and peace. Corrupt leadership would not define Israel's future. God's covenant purposes would endure. When we place Genesis and Isaiah side by side, a pattern becomes visible. Human beings repeatedly choose autonomy over trust. That choice produces fragmentation, injustice, and instability. But Scripture also presents another pattern. God preserves. God calls. God warns. God promises restoration. Decline may be real, but it is never ultimate. Genesis shows the theological roots of human disorder. Isaiah shows those roots manifesting in national life. Both texts insist that relationship with God remains the decisive factor in human flourishing or decline. The biblical narrative does not avoid crisis. It explains crisis within covenant relationship. Thank you for being here in this new section of Christian Lectures. This continues our ongoing exploration of the foundations of Christianity in a clear and structured way. In our next videos, we'll continue to trace how these Old Testament themes prepare the way for the New Testament fulfillment. Thank you for watching the video.